This is ArtSense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Dr. Emily Spratt, who is both a noted art historian and data scientist, working at the forefront of artificial intelligence's advancement into the world of art. Dr. Spratt provides a framework for understanding how AI is impacting the art world, while also examining the philosophical, ethical, and legal questions that the technology is forcing us to face. And now, a conversation about learning to see with Dr. Emily Spratt. Dr. Emily Spratt, thank you so much for joining me this week on the ArtSense podcast. Dr. Spratt, I wanted to have you on to discuss this nexus of fine art and artificial intelligence and what we're seeing and what's on the horizon. I felt like you were probably the person to talk to. And I think it'd be great for my viewers to kind of get an idea of who you are and maybe your background. And a lot of times with artists, I start with kind of like this dinner party sort of hypothetical where it's like, you know, if you're sitting at a dinner party next to a complete stranger who has no idea what you do, how do you start to explain to a stranger the fields that your research covers?
Well, the first question I would ask at a dinner party is, what wine are we drinking? But after that, I would tell them that I'm a Byzantine and Renaissance art historian that gradually became completely obsessed with what's happening with artificial intelligence starting in about 2013, 2014. And once I realized the developments that were happening with deep learning and fueled AI, I realized this was going to change everything in the world as we know it. And this sort of aha moment that the media is having now with AI, I had back then. And at that point in time, I then made a very conscientious decision to become somewhat of a hybrid academic, where I had then my traditional pursuits in the humanities, but then alongside this new burgeoning appetite that was just, phenomenal within me to understand as much as I could about what was happening in computer science, especially computer vision science. And I started researching that with as much ferocity as I was when I was then working on my PhD thesis in art history. And I guess as the years have gone by now, my work now tends to overlap more. And I'm less of a hybrid creature as the world basically has changed so significantly in its adaptations and uses of technology to really infiltrate all aspects of what we're doing, from how it is that we're viewing images online to how it is that we're making new images and videos.
I honestly don't know anyone else who has a PhD in the study of fine arts of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, as well as deep knowledge and graduate studies in data science. So you're a really interesting person to talk to, and it makes me wonder, did you see something, given your history with studying the Renaissance, are there similarities there to disruptive technologies and mindsets? I mean, were there fears in the Renaissance about accessibility of thinking? And, maybe is that kind of parallel to what we're seeing right now with fear around how AI is developing?
I'm not sure how much things were fear-driven in the Renaissance. I would say that wouldn't be a leading concern. But what the parallel that I notice has to do with our philosophical understanding of things as basic as what it means to see. And so it's really the Renaissance mode of philosophical inquiry that I think is having, in a sense, a resurgence now. People aren't calling it that, but ultimately, what technology is doing, emerging technologies in particular, are doing today, are causing for a reevaluation of some of the most basic questions in philosophy. And in terms of sort of the development of the humanities, especially sort of with postmodernist concerns, you could say, has gotten away from some of those very basic questions. I think these technologies are forcing us to ask the basics again. What does it mean to see? What does it mean to interpret the world through a lens of discovery that is facilitated through our senses? What is the role of sight, the most predominant sense, in sort of that quest for knowledge, for understanding of not only history, but the world around us as we're experiencing it?
It's really interesting because a lot of artificial intelligence is kind of precipitated on having to explain to a machine how to see. And that's kind of tied to from a philosophical standpoint, what does that mean, right?
I mean, I think the core of your question, you're really asking me, what does it mean to me to see? And then what does it mean to a computer? So let me try to unpack that a little bit. For me, really, seeing is one of the most powerful senses through which we are given a means to interact with, interpret, and discover the world around us. But really, in the last 50 years, however, with the creation and development of computer vision technology, certain components of sight have been proven very reproducible with machines. And this challenges our conception of what it means to see, what it means to behold an image. As our society becomes increasingly technocratic, what it means to see may actually be changing. And in thinking about this, we need to really maintain distinctions between sight as a human perceptual quality, as opposed to machine-enabled vision, and sight as a means for visual interpretation versus its use as a tool that aids in artistic production. I think it's also really important to remember that the concept of seeing is entirely related to the way in which our ability to transform visual information into knowledge about the world occurs through the brain. And our current understanding of the neurobiological processes of visual interpretation are actually really limited. And so I find it interesting how developments in computer vision challenge the art historian's very conception of the processes of aesthetic judgment, to use a Kantian term, and what may be regarded as objective or subjective mental processes if a computer has the ability to perform similar types of tasks. So that a computer could even measure art aesthetically challenges the field of art history to re-examine its own aesthetic constructs. And that sort of right there is the mechanism upon which I was referring to earlier in terms of the humanities really needing to come back to a reevaluation of some of these very basic questions, philosophical questions. I go back to as well, and sometimes I talk with my students about David Hume's conception of beauty, which he wrote that beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty. So thinking about that, if the interpretation of art lies in the eyes of the beholder and is thus a very subjectively determined process that is associated with feeling, the question is, how can we understand the development of autonomous aesthetic evaluation from a computer without reevaluating the processes of human aesthetic judgment and emotion? And so this, of course, brings up the question of the universality of visual experiences and also the role of the physical and mental experience of seeing in the shaping of one's own vision. And what I mean by that is we are very much living in a world where our attention is dominated by our screens. We are looking more and more at these surfaces, digital surfaces, and scrolling through loads and loads of images. And the question is that changing the way that we're interacting with images, the way that we're beholding with them? how has technology and the devices that we use, how are they influencing the way we see? How are they shaping our visual tastes? The history of art is very much based upon a juxtaposition of two images side by side, but no longer are we really thinking about images as a one-to-one comparison. It's more about the scroll of the images. And so I think when I go into this, I often look to art historian Michael Baxendall's theory of the period eye, and I question what is our period eye today in this digital world, and how is technology both creating and catalyzing our current mode, a cultural mode of vision, and are there universal components of this experience that we can then sort of quantify and maybe mimic with computers? What is then the role of the individual experience in this? All of these are questions that we're battling with today. One study that I find to be quite interesting when thinking about this is related to research that was published in 2014 by Yoon, Withoft, and Winnower, and others. And these were psychologists that were interested in looking at the Paraha tribe in Brazil that had essentially no exposure to representational visual media that we are so inundated with in our New York world here. Mm-hmm. And so the question that the researchers were posing is that would these people who were not used to seeing digital images, essentially, would they respond in similar ways to they were looking at a lot of two-tone images, black and white images, and things like that. How would they perceive these flat images? And indeed, they found that there is a difference in the way that they saw those images by not having had that life experience of looking at visual media in the way that that your average New Yorker might. So I think that we need to think about what are the cultural attitudes for seeing, what are the experience-based aspects of seeing, what are all of the physical things that go into seeing, and that, I certainly know that I seem to have lost some of my vision during COVID by looking at screens so much. My vision deteriorated greatly. Wow. How does the physical apparatus of seeing change than what I see in the world that we inhabit? And what is this world that we inhabit? Is it only the physical world of things that we navigate, or is that world really the digital world? The digital world is also part of our world now. And should we really be even separating the way we see in the physical world from the way we see in the digital world? And of course, all of this is going to kind of merge together as we start to do more things in the metaverse.
There's so much there that I find so interesting. Even us as humans, from childbirth, our eyes are being trained, our vision is being trained, and how our vision is trained here, as you referenced, in a New York society versus, somewhere else that's different. And, I feel like there's also how we emotionally react to certain imagery is tied to context and our own personal experiences with whatever the content is. And then there's just the whole aspect of if we're responding to images that are created by other humans like us, as that imagery starts to be created by the AI, it gets a little meta, but isn't the AI going to start influencing the way we see and perceive and establish tastes about imagery?
Yeah, I really appreciate the way that you sort of encapsulated all of that. I agree with you completely, and I think it is. I absolutely think it is. And my opinion of that has actually become stronger in the last couple of years. And that's especially with sort of the way that AI is taking off. And even those of us who have been working in AI for quite some time now everyone is quite surprised the degree to which things have really taken off. There was a kind of consensus that things would move a little bit more slowly. So these are great questions to be asking. And maybe one way to answer it is actually, I can just talk a little bit about my own experience recently of beholding an AI artwork and exhibition. And that's Rafik Anadol's work, Unsupervised, which is in MoMA right now. I encourage everyone to go and see it. And it's a beautiful, bright, undulating, adventurous exploration of all of the artworks that are in the museum and the way that the machine is basically analyzing the data, the archives of MoMA, and then projecting it back to the viewers in the museum. And I've long been a fan of Rafik's work, and I've been very fortunate to have curated some of his work in Paris. And I think that Unsupervised is a very, very powerful artwork, but in a way that has actually not been discussed in the media, at least so far. And that is the way it really stands out from the other artworks in MoMA. And so if you sit and watch the entire loop of Unsupervised, and then go and turn and view the walls of the museum, there is, I felt personally, a sense of dissatisfaction in how flat and almost boring the other artworks seem. Now, I like modern art very much. And that's not to say anything to lessen sort of, my interpretation of other artworks in the museum. But there is something about seeing something so dynamic and digitally alive as Anadol's artwork, and then sort of to look at a static image that it makes you think, my goodness, this work is really whetting my appetite for things to be bright with light and to be moving and undulating and detailed to the point of the pixel, that I almost can't stand any sort of blur. I need this precision in the image, a kind of nuanced perfectionism that certain types of AI artworks are almost I think pushing a demand for. And I loved the way that, so right after viewing this artwork, I went and looked at the wonderful Georgia O'Keeffe exhibition, which is beautifully titled To See Takes Time, based upon one of O'Keeffe's writings in her journal. And I loved it because I felt this, I had been just overwhelmed in the sensory experience of Rafik's work. And then I'm looking at these sketches and drawings for O'Keeffe's works, which really are so thoughtful in their deliberations, but yet such a contrast to the overwhelming sensory experience of Rafik's work, that it really, I thought, To See Takes Time is such a good title, because to see takes time in an analog world, but does it in a digital world? Does it in an AI infused digital world? And it made me think about the experience of seeing, especially when we look at things through our devices, and how we sometimes sort of zoom past things so quickly, that we're engaging with images in a rapid response manner that is absolutely changing the way that we think about these images, and also kind of increases our appetite for seeing more and more and more and faster, and in this sort of scrolling succession of things, that it's almost it's almost fueling a digital appetite for things that I just don't think could have been conceived of before. But it's not to say that that's without meaning, though, either. And I should actually point out that Jerry Saltz was pretty critical about Rafiq's artwork. He published this comment. He called it a glorified lava lamp, and like generating mediocrity. And I actually couldn't disagree more. While there are aspects of this artwork that do appear lava lamp like, what went into making it and the ideas that are behind it, and how it is that we're visualizing the data of art and the data of the analytics of it as well into this visualization. It's so much more than that. To see Rafiq's work as a glorified lava lamp is to miss the point entirely of what this artwork is about.
I feel like there's still going to be a place for what we think of as traditional imagery because, like you said, currently this imagery is new and exciting. And at some point, the opposite, just like in music, things go from pop to grunge back to pop. Is it possible that all of this saturation and bright colors and movement may actually create a period where people want to get back to, traditional earthy imagery that is tied to things that are more substantive?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a spot on observation, Craig. Really, there is right now much interest in the makers movement, arts and crafts, and I love that there's actually a this sort of cultural reaction to this. It's almost feeding a desire for authenticity on the level of woven wools.
So, Emily, you've actually hands-on gotten into creating an AI project, right? So can you talk a little bit about the project that you did with Chef Alain Passard of the 3-star Michelin restaurant Arpège in Paris about AI and exploring the art and the perception of the beauty of plating dishes?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, well, the project started when I recognized that the plates at L'Arpège, to me, seemed more like Matisse cutouts than a traditional meal on a plate. And I questioned immediately whether Alain was in fact an artist, a visual artist, maybe before he was even a chef. And then discovered that that was indeed the case. It would be sort of a beautiful story, actually. I was celebrating something at the restaurant, and I had this epiphany while dining there. And it was very lucky that Alain was he's often at the restaurant, but it was very lucky that he was there, and I was able to ask him directly if he was a visual artist. And that was really sort of the origins of this wonderful collaboration that I did with him and the wonderful staff at the restaurant at large. And so when I discovered that he was a visual artist and he was working in the medium of collage and montage to actually design what the vegetables cut out would look like on the plate when then presented to diners in the restaurant, I thought, now that's fascinating, because here you have an example of an artist creating something in sort of the visual realm with these collages, but then also manifesting it with food. And could we understand something about the relationship of then the cutout sort of collages and then the plates of food? Could we understand something about the visual relationships? How close did then the restaurant get the actual plate that's then served at L'Arpège to the cutout from which the concept derived? And I thought that given the developments that were happening with generative AI, and this project, we started this at the end of 2018. And I thought that this would actually be a really interesting way to experiment with what was going on with generative adversarial networks. And I, as a researcher, am often thinking about things in an artistic way, such as, what would be the best GANs-based project that we could do, so that I could then philosophically think about what the relation is for the development of GANs for uses in creative industries and so on and so forth. And so a lot of my research has a kind of artistic angle to it as well, because I'm actually trying to push experimentally what one can do with technology in a sort of philosophical experimentation kind of way. And so this project is exactly this. So let me just sort of back up for a second and explain to the audience here what exactly is meant by a generative adversarial network. This is one framework used for generative AI. So really, it's content-based generation of AI. And it's a class of machine learning frameworks for the creation of content, especially images, which works by having two neural networks set up in opposition to each other in the form of a zero-sum game, where one agent's gain is then essentially another agent's loss. And maybe I should actually just back up here as well and mention that my interest in AI has been all along is really, once deep learning, which is a subfield within machine learning, once really deep learning exploded, largely based upon the research of Geoffrey Hinton and Jan LeCun, for instance, that you really have the concept of AI from the 50s is sort of like somewhat obsolete, and deep learning infused AI takes on a kind of life of its own. And this is all about the use of large, multi-layer artificial neural networks that are computing with lots of continuous representations that are organized in a way that is hierarchically similar to the way that we conceptually imagine neurons in human brains to be organized. But that's just sort of a model of thinking about it, not actually how it's working. Essentially, for deep learning, we're employing all types of machine learning, but it's better for generalizing things from small data, and better for scaling up with big data to do these like large computations. Anyway, so just wanted to kind of go into sort of like what learning is and how that's sort of very relevant to what I'm talking about with GANs. Anyway, so what we basically did with using generative adversarial networks was looking at, given the close relationship between these Michelin plates of food that were being made in the restaurant and their visual conception in the form of collages, our first experiment was to determine whether it was possible to utilize AI to visually probe this connection between the chef's ideas and then their manifestation. And so the question was, how could GANs emulate culinary images, and would doing so visually reveal anything about the creative process itself between the chef's abstracted notion of plates and collages with their actual execution as dishes? And so additionally, the images of the collected plates and collages were then gathered as separate groups of images, but they didn't exactly have a one-to-one correspondence, meaning that the two sets of images were not visually matched. So you couldn't say that this visual collage was 100% this visual plate. And also important for the way that we are thinking about deep learning is these images were not labeled. We did not have a text-based description that identified what this was or any other indication. So it was basically a data set of unmarked images. Or then this sort of then led us to realize that what we needed to do was to think about using a program which would allow, in the best possible way, for unsupervised learning to happen, as opposed to supervised learning, which would be where the data set is then labeled and what each thing is. So we chose and then tweaked a little bit, a program called CycleGAN. And we use that especially because it does not require the paired images to be used for the automatic analysis and generation of the image sets in this sort of labeled fashion. So the program utilizes two generators, and this goes back to how generative adversarials sort of in their concept worked. Two generators, one set that maps one set of images or domain to another set of images, and then the second, which performs the opposite mapping of the image groups. And there's a very famous example of this, and it's actually trying to make one set of images of horses to appear as zebras and vice versa. This is the classic example from computer vision science of how to make all of this work. And so in the same manner that, you can make a horse appear like a zebra and a zebra appear like a horse, the photographs of the Michelin plates were used in relation to the chef's collages. And as the computer trained, it was analyzing and learning from the domains that it had been given. Then in a process known as translation, CycleGAN was able to render the particular image in the likeness of the groups to which it was being related. And thus it would illustrate visually the results of the translated image from one domain to the other and back again. And then if successfully orchestrated, it produces the original image again, and in the final lineup, it provides a visual measure then to check that the process works successfully. So you get to essentially see then through the process of CycleGAN and then the visualizations that it's then making, you're able to actually then see what the visual comparisons look like, what essentially it is that the computer is seeing as the relationships between all of these images. And I found that really fascinating from an experimental point of view, because here it is, we're almost looking inside of the computer in a way and are able to see how it's conceiving of these relationships. And so that gets into a very hot topic in AI right now, actually, where there's much interest in understanding. It's not possible to know exactly what's going on with AI. This is the so-called, black box of artificial intelligence. But we have these ways visually to kind of pull out certain moments of what's being visualized. And, even Google's Deep Dream project was doing exactly that. And that's fascinating. All of that is fascinating for the growing field of interpretability, which is all about trying to understand what's going on in the black box. But from an artistic side, I was fascinated by then what these images were, and then how the computer then was essentially understanding what it was to convey a tomato carpaccio in then the style of a collage. How good would the collage be, and then how good would a collage of tomatoes cut then render into then what the actual dish would be. But that wasn't sort of enough for us. And Alana and I are both big fans of Giuseppe Arcimboldo, the wonderful Renaissance painter that was active in the court of Rudolph and in Prague. And we then wanted to basically see if we could make portraits of people, people-based portraits, but no one in particular. So we actually used another AI model to generate portraits of people that did not exist, a well-known model.
And, for the folks that maybe don't have as great understanding of art history, these portraits back in that time period, he was specializing in portraits that were comprised of fruits and vegetables, right? He was making human figures out of fruits and vegetables visually,
Yes,
correct?
exactly. And this was very much about, in the court of Rudolph II, this was very much about an interest in alchemy, an interest in nature, the philosophies of imitation. This is very much what was going on with these images was very much about the entanglement of art and science and court intrigues into that area in a very sort of scientific manner. And so I love that it once again, the Renaissance sort of way of thinking about the world sort of comes into play with how we might be able to think about things today with AI. And so the idea was, could we then make a Michelin plate which of course Michelin plates being very much tied up with prestige and certain socioeconomic markers of success and so on and so forth, very much like a court in the early modern period, you could say. But could we then essentially mimic a Giuseppe Arcimboldo portrait of the emperor by using then what the computer was generating of these Michelin plates? And so we actually were successful in being able to do that, to create then a Michelin plate-based portrait of a person, of an anonymous sort of person. But what was so fascinating about our experimentations into this realm was that the images we created looked incredibly tacky. There's no other way to put it. And so actually the back propagation image that was sort of verifying that it was working correctly, that then did the opposite, which was then visualizing how the portrait of the person, the anonymous person, would then manifest within then the plate itself. That was what I found visually really interesting. And so then we decided to focus on sort of tweaking then the images that were then the plates of food, which then seemed to have faces emerging from within them. And then there was some at the time it was exciting. There was interest in the work we were doing there. Sort of 2018, 2019. This was when France was interested in becoming the Silicon Valley of Europe. This was one of President Macron's visions of sort of the future of technology in the country. I think the priority on that has changed a little bit since the pandemic. However, because of the word of this project that I was doing with Chef Pissard, then essentially we were invited to exhibit the results at the Global Forum on AI for Humanity that happened in October, on sort of the eve of the pandemic. But ultimately, because of the work I was doing in this realm, then I was asked to be the art curator for the Global Forum, and then brought in other artworks as well to sort of not just look at AI art in an aesthetic lens, the way that a lot of the auction houses has tried to sort of showcase AI, but to think about it more as philosophical experimentation about these questions that we've been talking about, Craig, what it means to see, but then also what are then the ethical considerations that all of this brings up. And the project with L'Arpège was very much about provoking an ethical discussion on what it means to create images in this way and how we interpret them.
As you were doing this project, I know one of your goals was to peer inside the black box, but there is a mechanism for human intervention in training and retraining and refining. And my impression is that if you wanted to continue to iterate that process, you could better train the desired result, which I think brings up another philosophical question of that would be one person's perception of beauty. Is that a universal perception of beauty?
Yeah, I think that your question gets into a really big ethical issue with sort of the use of AI in our society today. And that is their reliance on these large data sets that then are being harvested to generate what is being called new content. So we've had the growth of what are called foundational models, which are an emerging sort of class of computer models, transformers, which are trained by self supervision on large scale broad data, that are easily adapted to perform a wide range of sort of downstream tasks. So the best examples of that are large pre-trained language models like GPT-3, GPT-4, but the term also extends to models for all modalities of data and sort of even knowledge. But these foundation models are problematic because what the data is that goes into the training of a model then is already a selection and interpretation in many ways of the world. And we tend to assume that just because we're using a pre-trained model to understand something, that this is somehow a kind of neutral interpretation of things when it is anything but that. One of the things that I try to emphasize when I'm teaching is the importance of really knowing what the data set is that goes into any AI project. It's such a basic concept, but one that is often overlooked. It's all about the data set, sort of bias in, bias out. What the data set is makes all the difference on what is then outputted. And sort of to get back to the crux of your question, if the data set is the canon of art history, that already then is a set of expectations and values and judgments on art that then go into then the production of new content. And you can't divorce that new content from what the original data set is. And as far as images are concerned, most models have pre-training based upon things like ImageNet, which was a large data set that was developed by Professor Fei-Fei Li at Stanford University, that was very foundational for the way that all images are classified. And there are other data sets like ImageNet as well that go into what it makes any sort of generative output. So it's not really possible to remove biases when images themselves are so loaded with meaning, and the way, what it is that appears digitally and then is able to be scraped offline. That makes all the difference in what it is that we're producing. And there are huge ethical questions with that. A lot of companies claim that, okay, you're an artist, you can have your own artworks be analyzed, and then you can generate new content for yourself as an artist using our models. But if they're based on foundational models that have to do with the canon of art history, or just what was available when images were scraped, that goes into then what the output is. There's no way around that. And the question is, to what degree does any one particular image have in what that output is, and what are then the rights around those images individually that go into the data set? It becomes murky really quickly. And I think that this is such a fascinating area to watch, because it's really copyright and laws around image use that are going to sort of help lead the way in how artists and large companies are using this information. And so that's already changing very quickly, and it should.
I reached out just this week to a copyright lawyer that specializes in the fine arts, and to look at having a future episode to talk about, just the changing landscape of copyrights, given, some of the decisions the Supreme Court's been making. And I definitely see it applying here, because I know recently on Instagram, I came across an artist who was showing the different works that he had made using AI. And to me, it was obvious that the data set was very heavily influenced by John Curran. And I'm just like, I see what's coming out as the output, but it's really easy for me to recognize what the input was. And if it's easy for me to recognize what the input was, a lot of artists haven't expressly given permission for their works to be included in these data sets. And now their work is becoming, part of a chain of events that leads to new work being created based on their work, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I'm working on a book right now that's getting into a lot of these questions. And I think a clear-cut case of what you're describing is what's going on with Getty Images, the Getty Images lawsuit right now. And if you have AI systems that are, in fact, recreating the watermark of Getty Images, I mean, that's a pretty clear-cut case of not only using an image without permission, but also trademark infringement. And so what's fascinating is that now there are these new copyright clauses that are allowing for images to be used at large in a data set, a new sort of copyright category that one can apply for specifically when an individual or an entity is interested in using lots of images for trainings for AI related projects. And now there is the possibility of getting permissions for using images at large. And so that's what your example is fascinating, because the question is, well, if one particular hand, an artist's hand or an artist's signature style, then is so obvious, even when that copyright category is purchased, then what happens actually when you can distill it on an individual basis? Then maybe that copyright category falls apart a little bit, because I think that there could be a claim for that artist to then say, well, hold on a second, the data set was being used at large, but here this is so obviously based on my signature. Something must be done about it. I think that the world was really hoping that with the recent verdict with the Andy Warhol case, I think people were expecting some, sort of more guidelines for how things would be worked out in the space. But that's not been as useful as it would have been liked in terms of things have remained murky.
To say the least. Where are you headed from here? Where else are you performing research? I mean, again, it sounds like you're about 10 years ahead of the curve on looking at these things. If I'm hoping to get your guidance on what's just over the hill, where are you applying your efforts?
I am very focused on quantum computing right now. And quantum computing is really going to be what revolutionizes AI, because right now, what we're performing with AI is exceeding is starting to exceed the abilities of what computers can really handle. And once we are able to utilize quantum computing more, then the possibilities with AI will be truly limitless. And with all the concerns and the doomsday sayers that are out there, I would say that we don't have to really worry so much right now. But once quantum computing and AI come together, that's when we need to really start to watch. But that being said, I'm also really fascinated in what is the research that's happening with quantum computing regarding the quantum composition of light and how light interacts with materials. One researcher whose work I'm closely following is Nanfeng Yu, Professor Nanfeng Yu at Columbia, who's working on this topic. And I think that, especially for the creative industry, the way that we will in the very near future be able to harness how light interacts with materials, it will be in a way that is probably hard to fathom right now. And in terms of kind of immersive like metaverse types of experiences, once we get these things worked out with quantum computing and lights, I think that the possibilities for how we visually interact with and behold AR type of experiences will be just sort of out of this world, and will certainly revive. Sort of VR and AR has been sort of like a little bit on the decline. I think that once we are able to harness light in these new ways and to specify its vibrancies on the quantum lattice level, I think that the possibilities for those things are going to take off again.
Well, I think just today, June 5th, Apple announced the release of their new AR VR headset. I think that's going to be a game changer in terms of if Apple puts their weight behind something now, the developer community is going to, rush with billions of dollars of funding to build ways to enjoy that hardware that Apple's committed to, right? And so it's a train that is coming down the tracks pretty fast. So
yeah, in the same vein, I'm also I'm really interested in what's happening on the level of brain interfaces. And some of Meta's work currently in this area is certainly to be followed. But I also find it a little bit scary that some of the brain projects that we're doing almost are exceeding our ability of what we currently understand about neurobiology. And sometimes I do think that one needs to slow down, and there's much cause for reflection if we're building things when we don't quite know how they work. I mean, this is the whole issue and the controversy around AI right now, and how AI interfaces then with these new technologies of, computing and the brain. I do think that we need to pause a little bit and try to gain more understanding of how all these systems are coming together. But at the same time, I should say that the letter that has been going around, people calling for a 1-year moratorium on research on AI, I did not sign that and wouldn't sign that because I think it's very important to always be researching, always to be asking questions. The pursuit of knowledge is never a bad thing. But how we ethically do it, of course, is important, but that should be sort of developing in tandem and sort of seamlessly with everything that is going on. But innovation cannot be halted, and to try to do so, I think, is a bit of a fool's errand.
Well, Emily, I really appreciate your time this afternoon. I just can't thank you enough for helping bring clarity to this issue. I'm so happy to have met you and know you because your field of study is only going to become more integral in our society. I wish you a lot of luck with your continued pursuit of knowledge.
Craig, thank you so much for this interview. It's really been a pleasure. I appreciate the great questions. The only thing I would say, though, in terms of clarity, is that the real clarity is that there's much complexity. And I think that one thing that we have to be careful of in AI studies is being sure not to oversimplify things.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to Cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.